Psychologist Wilson Van Dusen, PhD, has developed theories regarding reality and mysticism through empiric research. His books, including The Presence of Other Worlds, Testimony to the Invisible, Essays on Swedenborg, and Beauty, Wonder, and the Mystical World. For anyone interested in examining ghosts, spirits, and other paranormal phenomena from as broad a perspective as possible, Van Dusen's research is rich, powerful, and thought-provoking. Van Dusen is a scholar of the life and works of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century intellectual colossus and Renaissance man. Swedenborg wrote 150 books in 17 sciences, was an expert in numerous crafts, was an accomplished musician and politician, and a prolific inventor, and was fluent in 9 languages. Those who recognize his name today usually think of Swedenborg as a Swedish mystic who claimed that he had daily communication with angels, demons, and other inhabitants of the unseen world, and whose experiences with remarkable psychic phenomena were well documented. Through the course of his study and research, Van Dusen found what he believed to be evidence supporting one of Swedenborg's most unusual doctrines, that the lives of human beings are dependent on a relationship with the hierarchy of spirits. In his position as a clinical psychologist in a state mental hospital, Van Dusen set out to describe his patients' hallucinations as faithfully as possible. Although he noticed similarities between the descriptions given by his mental patients and Swedenborg's discussions of the relationships of humans to spirits, it was not until 3 years after Van Dusen had completed collecting data from his patients that he discovered the striking similarities between what his patients had shared with him in the 20th century and what Swedenborg described in his accounts centuries earlier. That was a long sentence. In his opinion, Swedenborg's descriptions of experiences with what we today call the paranormal seem to mirror his own patients' experiences and help explain otherwise puzzling aspects of hallucinations. After dealing with hundreds of individuals who suffered from hallucinations, schizophrenia, alcoholism, brain damage, and senility, Van Dusen discovered that he was able to communicate with the hallucinations his patients endured. He began to look for patients who were able to distinguish between their own thoughts and the products of their hallucinations. The doctor told the patients that he wished to gain as accurate descriptions of their experiences as possible. He promised no special reward and offered no hope for recovery. Some patients, he learned, were embarrassed by what they heard or saw. In other instances, he had reassured the patient and the hallucination. Van Dusen attempted to establish a relationship with both his patients and their hallucinations, which remained invisible to him. Van Dusen's methodology was to interview his patients or their hallucinations directly. He instructed the patient to give a word-for-word account of what the voices answered or what was seen. In this way, the psychologist could hold long dialogues with the patient's hallucinations, recording both questions and answers. Van Dusen's only purpose was to come to as accurate a description as possible of the patient's experiences, treating the hallucinations as reality because that was what they were to the patient. On numerous occasions, I don't know why that word came out that way. Let's just start over. On numerous occasions, Van Dusen found that he was engaged in conversation with hallucinations, and that the dialogue was far above the patient's level of comprehension. He found this to be especially true when he contacted the higher orders of hallucinations. This is in these, which he discovered to contain and exist in a symbolical depth beyond the patient's normal understanding. The psychologist also learned that in most cases the hallucinations had come upon the patients very suddenly. The consistent finding was that the patients believed that they had somehow established contact with another world, dimension, or order of beings. Van Dusen soon learned that all of his patients objected to the term hallucination. Each had coined his own terms, such as the other order, the eavesdroppers, and so forth. The voices the patients heard were completely audible in human languages and on occasion would assume the qualities of someone known to the patient in an attempt to deceive them. Such pranks and the shouting of vile and obscene messages and threats were the work of the lower order, in quotes, of entities. Members of the lower order suggested lewd acts and encouraged the patient to indulge in them. Then they would scold the patient for having even considered such thoughts. These beings ought to find a weak point of conscience and work on it interminably. According to Van Dusen, they invade every nook and cranny of privacy, work on every weakness and credibility, claim awesome powers, lie, make promises, and then undermine the patient's will. They never have a personal identity, though they accept most names or identities given them. Van Dusen found the lower order consistently anti-religious, and some actively obstructed the patient's religious practices. Occasionally they would refer to themselves as demons and speak of hell. The higher order of hallucinations stood in direct contrast to such demonic manifestations, but Van Dusen found that they made up only a fifth or less of the patient's experiences. The higher order respects the patient's freedom and does not work against his will, while the lower order prattles on endlessly. The higher order seldom speaks. Van Dusen also discovered that the higher order is much more likely to be symbolic, religious, supportive, genuinely instructive, and communicate directly with the inner feelings of the patient. In general, the higher order is richer than the patient's normal experience. The psychologist likened the higher order to Carl Jung's theory of archetypes, whereas he compared the lower order to Freud's concept of the id. In contrast to the lower order, the higher order thinks in something like universal ideas in ways that are richer and more complex than the patient's own mode of thought, Van Dusen said. The communications from the higher order can be very powerful emotionally. I know people don't like it when you breathe into the microphone, so I'm trying to spend my breathing. Can be very powerful emotionally and carry an almost inexpressible ring of truth higher. The higher order tends to enlarge a patient's value, something like a very wise and considerate instructor, he commented. After intensive study, Van Dusen concluded that there were a number of points similarly between Swedenborg's description of a spiritual hierarchy and his own findings. Van Dusen's patients acted independently of each other and yet gave similar accounts. They also agree on every particular I could find with Swedenborg's account, he said. My own findings were established years before I really examined Swedenborg's position in this matter. In Van Dusen's opinion, it seemed remarkable that, over 2 centuries of time, men of very different cultures working under entirely different circumstances on quite different people could come to such familiar findings. Because of this, I am inclined to speculate that we are looking at a process which transcends cultures and remains stable over time. Van Dusen also wondered whether the hallucinations of his patients described the vast majority of his colleagues in psychological literature as being detached pieces of unconscious, and the phenomenon of spiritual possession might not simply be 2 ways of describing the same process. Are they really spirits or pieces of one's own unconscious? Van Dusen reflected that it may be necessary to change how we approach an understanding of reality because, as Swedenborg has indicated, our lives may be the little free space at the confluence of giant higher and lower spiritual hierarchies. Humans contend that we have free will, but in actuality we could be freely poised between good and evil and under the influence of cosmic forces most of us don't even believe exist. The decisions made by human beings believing that they are exercising their free will may actually be resultant of other forces. Most people find the thought that they might be at the mercy of unseen forces very discomforting, and they will argue quite forcefully that they have free will to choose their own destiny. Others who have come face to face with the unknown are rather less certain and are willing to ponder the possibility that entities from some other dimension of reality may seek to influence, disrupt, or control